This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt stuck, whether it's a major life transition, a dark night of the soul, or just staying small out of fear. If you've ever struggled to move forward, if you're repeating unhealthy patterns in relationships, or you have a black belt in beating yourself up, you were meant for more, and this podcast is for you. We'll get real, we'll get vulnerable, we'll probably cuss a little bit, and we'll get to the root of it all, your self-worth. With every step, you'll find the courage to rise. So I've talked a lot over the years about the idea that as humans, one of the questions that we deeply ask ourselves is, am I enough? And the question of not feeling good enough, not feeling like we're good enough for ourselves, for our relationship, for the things that we desire, that we're somehow less than other people, that feeling of not being enough comes up so frequently for us, whether we're conscious of it or not. Part of my work is, of course, to bring consciousness to that. But there's a flip side to that. There is a pendulum swing to that primarily I see this in women. My audience is mostly women. I happen to be a woman. I identify as a woman. Therefore, I can only speak from my experience. If you're a gentleman listening to this and it resonates, take what it is for your life. Everything is open. But what I see for women in particular is this pendulum swing of not being enough, not feeling enough in how we look and what other people think about us and how we compare ourselves to others, not being worthy, all those things. And there's also the flip side of that we don't often talk about or name, which is as women, we equally worry that we are too much. And I know when I say that, the women listening all went, oh, yeah. Because just as much as we worry that we are not enough, we worry that we're going to be too much. That we will be too loud, too boisterous, too sexy, too successful, right? Or that what we're feeling is literally too much. And so the flip side of not feeling enough, right, is feeling like we might also be too much, which means that we then intentionally and unconsciously, again, rarely do we do this consciously, we shrink ourselves down, desperately trying to find the balance between not being good enough and being perceived as too much. Because if we're too much, we'll be judged by other people. But on the flip side, we don't feel good enough. And so we are caught in this pendulum swing, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, desperately looking for a balance. And then we wonder why we constantly feel like we aren't able to be happy, like we aren't able to be content, like we're constantly burned out, because there is this pendulum swing back and forth, not enough, too much, not enough, too much. Then what happens is we bring our own judgment in, and we see women that are doing their damn thing, right? Sometimes we don't know how consciously they're doing it, but frankly, that's not any of our business. But we see women that are wearing a super sexy dress, or that are speaking out about something, or are simply just making a decision that is right for them, and we unconsciously or consciously start to judge them. Oh, she needs to tone it down a little bit. Ooh, she doesn't need to cuss so much. All right, I get that one a lot, and I don't fucking care, obviously. I'm okay being too much. This is me. I am all of me. I am too much. I am all the things. But we then bring judgment onto other people who actually may be living from a place of greater freedom than we even think is possible. And because it doesn't feel available to us, sometimes we will judge them for that, right? We judge. Spike's joining the show today. Did not secure the closet enough. And yes, we're going to keep right on rocking, and I'm not going to edit that out, because another thing I would love to see more of is let's just generally be authentic about what it is we're doing. And sometimes my animals walk in while I'm recording podcasts. So on we go. But we will find ourselves in judgment of other people. And anytime, you can take this to the bank, anytime we are in judgment of anyone else, the person we are actually judging is ourselves. Because we would not be sitting in judgment of anyone else if it was something that we didn't have any kind of charge around, right? Let's say, we see a woman who is very happy, who is owning her sensuality and her sexuality for herself, not for anyone else, not for a man or a woman or anyone else, but for herself, who genuinely feels good and free in her body, who chooses to travel or, have a career path that might be a little non-traditional, or maybe it's traditional, but she does it in a quote-unquote non-traditional way. And what can sometimes happen is we will bring in the sour grapes, right? Oh, well, she must be really miserable. Oh, well, her life looks way too happy. She must have deep, dark secrets, all this stuff. We bring in the sour grapes, which is a form of jealousy, which is also a form of judgment. And I don't want to get off topic here, but jealousy is an indication of something that we actually want ourselves and feel is unavailable to us. So we create sour grapes. And if you don't know what I mean by sour grapes, just Google the Aesop's Fable. There's a little education in every show. But the idea that we are bringing judgment onto someone else, and especially women judging other women. Ladies, we got to knock that shit off. We got bigger issues in the world. We cannot be pulling each other down, right? We got to lift each other up. But the judgment that we bring when we see somebody living that type of life is a reflection of something that we want in ourselves. Maybe, wearing something that makes us feel incredibly powerful in our sensuality and our sexuality for ourselves feels really edgy and feels like way too much, right? And so we will unconsciously judge someone else for doing it because there's a freedom there in their too muchness, right? Which is a complete sidebar, like too much for fucking what? Like, and for fucking whom, right? Like, if you're living from what genuinely feels good for you, this is what all of this is in a nutshell. Literally everything that I teach, everything that I talk about and write about comes down to, are you living in a conscious way? Are you consciously choosing how you're showing up in life? Are you consciously choosing to embrace your quote unquote too much because it's literally what feels really good and true to you? That's really what the answer is. And the reason that we as women in particular get caught in this pendulum swing between not enough and too much is because over the years, and I'm talking hundreds and thousands of years, as women, we have lost touch with our natural intuition, our innate knowing, the wisdom of our bodies of what is a yes and what is a no, and what is an authentic yes and what is a no. And because of that, we find ourselves caught in this back and forth, not enough, too much, not enough, too much, worrying about other people's perceptions, worrying about what other people will think, right? Which is a whole other podcast altogether. But examining the places in your life where you're feeling caught in the pendulum swing of I'm either not enough or I'm going to be too much. Sometimes as women in relationships with our men, we will go, ooh, that's going to be too much for him. He can't handle that. Well, if it's just naturally who you are, and if you're not being a toxic cow and projecting your shit onto another human being, then it's not being too much. It's just you're being you. And when it's coming from a conscious place, you being you, you're not going to be everybody's cup of tea. Dita Von Teese says you can be the juiciest peach in the whole world. There's still going to be somebody who doesn't like peaches, right? So if your too muchness is really just who you authentically are in any given day and in any given moment, maybe you're not everybody's peach. You're not everybody's cup of tea. You might be their cup of strong coffee. And this feeling of worrying we're too much. It's funny because as I was thinking about doing this episode, I was reflecting back many decades ago now to high school prom of all things. And one of my very best friends at the time, lovely human, still is to this day, was fairly conservative in her dress, was very understated. And we went prom dress shopping. And I think I talked her into trying on this dress that was definitely not part of her traditional wardrobe, right? It was this beautiful sequined dress. And not just that it was sequin. I really didn't get into the sparkle thing until later on in life. But it was the tone, and it had this beautiful ombre to it in these reds, rich reds and deep oranges. And when she put that on with her coloring and her figure, which she had a slammin' figure that she always wore under giant sweater, slammin' figure. And she put this dress on, and I was just blown away. Even at, 18 years old, the tender age that I was just like, wow. I mean, she was a number one stunner in this thing. And it was just such a flattering dress in so many ways. And at that point, I knew nothing of what I know now. I wanted so much for her to buy that dress because I saw who she became when she put that on. And she took it off, put it back on the rack. At that point, it was too much. And, we can talk another time about what our nervous systems can hold. But more than that, I think it came back to me when I was thinking of sometimes when we step outside of what we perceive ourselves to be and try on something new, literally the sparkly fire goddess dress. I still wish I could go back and buy that dress for her. And we see, it's like we tap into this potential of what our power might be, who we might be, what we might channel when we step into that quote unquote too muchness. And as women, sometimes it scares the shit out of us. And again, there's a whole thing. I mean, I could podcast after podcast after podcast, which probably I will do, about the witch wound, about, the conditioning, generational trauma that women have that we're working through to step back into our power, to reclaim our power. And when we tap into that feeling of, I'm edging out of what people think I am, of who people think I have been or was quote unquote supposed to be, and maybe that's too much. Let me shrink back. Let me take off this fiery gown that makes me literally look like a fucking goddess. And let me go back. Let me go back to hiding. And it's okay. Listen, I just told a client today, anything that we do is fine. There are no right or wrong decisions. It's the consciousness from which we make that choice. And there's also a time and a place when we can't shrink anymore. We can't shrink ourselves down in an effort to balance the being way too much or the not being enough or the being pleasing to other people or not wanting to upset people, all those things. And there is a time and a place to just say, fuck it, literally. I'm going to be too much if that is really what feels good for me. And I was having this conversation with a friend about this topic, and I'm not a parent, she's a parent, and she was talking about how this shows up for her with her kids, of feeling and having an intuition when a child might be sick, right? Well, is it going to be too much if I take them to the doctor? Are they going to feel like I'm overreacting? All these things where we start to question ourselves. As women in particular, we start to question ourselves. Am I not enough? Am I too much? Some version of that when we're questioning doing something, when we're questioning something that actually feels right for us in our gut, but we have gotten so disconnected from our intuition that we are spending our time worrying about how are other people going to perceive us, what are they going to think? And this is part of the journey for us as women, is coming back to trusting our bodies, to trusting our intuition. Women, I know, ladies that are listening to this, you know your gut, when you really listen to it, has never been wrong, not even once. Not your fear, not your anxiety, not your worry. I'm talking about your knowing with a capital K. Your knowing has never been wrong. And part of the way that we start to break down this pendulum between not enough and too much is coming back to trusting ourselves, coming back to trusting the part of us that already knows, and not questioning what the perception is going to be of us. Because I think that so many of us, and I include myself in this, lived our lives and maybe continue to live our lives worrying way too much. That's the too much you should worry about. Way too much about what other people think about us. And it creates a life where we stay small, we stay suppressed, we end up on medication, drinking a lot, coping mechanisms, just generally kind of a little bit unhappy with their lives. Not massively unhappy, but definitely not content. And so part of this is bringing the awareness to where in your life you feel you're too much. When you feel that too much come up, and checking in and going, is this really me? Because if this is really me, it's not too much. It's just who I am. And this idea that somehow we're meant to be the good girl, capital G's, the good girl who is always pleasing, who always has just a neutral baseline on all the things, doesn't want to make anybody else unhappy, wants to always be pleasing, who feels like she's not enough, and who worries that she's too much. I'm going to challenge you. Be too fucking much. Be too fucking much. If it's coming from a place of who you genuinely are, not who somebody told you you had to be too fucking much. Do your work. Don't project your stuff onto other people. Always take responsibility for yourself. But err on the side of being too much. And if anyone is going to judge you for that, remember, that is their shit. That is not yours. And if they're judging you, they're the ones that need to do the work. And at the end of the day, what does anyone else's perception, their judgment, their projections matter if you are actually finally happy and content and at peace in your life? Because the flip side and the opposite choice is living behind a mask of trying to be perfect, trying to be pleasing, trying to fit yourself into a box that you don't fucking fit in and never will. So the antidote to not feeling enough and equally feeling too much, be too fucking much. Find what your too much is, what you perceive that to be, and be it. And do it. And with love, always with love. Don't actually go tell people this. I mean, you can. You have free will. You have free choice. But give zero fucks. Care less about what people think about you and care way more about what you think about you and how genuinely happy you are to be in your life, to be in your body, and maybe, just maybe, to be too much for some people, because those are not your people. Sparkle on. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Courage to Rise podcast. Visit my website, couragetorise.com, for more information on one-on-one coaching, group coaching programs, and other upcoming events. Remember, life's too short not to sparkle. Sparkle on.